Matariki is the Māori name for the star cluster Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters. Matariki is also the name for an international network of 7 universities that are distinguished by their historic traditions and unique approach to facing contemporary challenges. The Matariki Lecture Series offers a short program of lectures addressing current research themes or areas of common interest.
This time, the lecture series is on race, racism, and decolonization, with a specific focus on practical impacts of racism on everyday living.
Thank you very much, Astrid. I hope you can all see my slides on the screen. Let me know if you can't. Okay, so a slightly different tone, I think, to my presentation, or a slightly different perspective, because I naturally come at this from a legal perspective. My paper is entitled Homelessness, Race and Law. And why am I speaking about this? Well, before joining academia, as Astrid mentioned, I practiced as a barrister for a long time. So I worked firsthand with people who experienced discrimination and disadvantage, whether that be from a local authority, whether that be in housing, and particularly in homelessness, so in the context of homelessness. And what I observed from my legal practice was this discrimination and differentiation in treatment of people from a BAME background, Black and minority ethnic background, as compared with their white counterparts. And now that I'm in academia, I work with homelessness charities, organisations and groups to investigate the experiences of BAME people in relation to housing matters in the UK, but principally in England. So this paper is part of an ongoing piece of research that I'm engaged in at Durham with a network of stakeholders, looking at things like how race impacts homelessness, the experience of homelessness, but also the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the financial crisis that we've been experiencing, particularly in Europe, but also in the US over the last decade or so. So this paper is part of that ongoing research that myself and a team of researchers are engaged in. Okay, next slide. So what is this paper really about then? Well, I've put some context for you on the slide. And what this context is the latest or the clearest data that we have, the latest full year data on the experience of BAME people in terms of homelessness and accessing homelessness services in England. And the context is, I think, striking. And I don't think you need to be from a legal background or any particular background to understand the seriousness of what this data reveals. So as it says on the slides, 1 in 23 Black households will be homeless or threatened with homelessness, as compared with 1 in 83 households of all other ethnicities combined. 11% of homeless people applying for homelessness help are Black, even though in England, Black people make up just 3% of the population. This is perhaps the next point, is perhaps the most striking of all. Almost a quarter of people making homelessness applications in the last 12 months came from BAME groups, even though taken together, the BAME population in England is only around 11%. And then this final statistic, a BAME person becomes homeless or threatened with homelessness in England every 8 minutes. So that, I think, well, I hope, really demonstrates the importance and the impetus to do more in this area, to investigate and hopefully to improve the position for BAME groups, populations in England. It goes without saying that having a stable home, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, is vital to all of our health, physical, mental well-being. But it also impacts on our opportunities, our career prospects, our educational opportunities also. So it's really hard to overstate the importance of having a home. And therefore, really, it makes the case again of the importance of tackling this discrimination and these problems that we see, this overrepresentation of BAME individuals in the homelessness context in England. Now, of course, I have to be well aware, and this is something that's come out of the research network that I'm a part of at Durham, that there's a lot of sensitivity in this area. And I'm always conscious when I'm talking about BAME populations, that term itself, BAME, is not a term that all people of those communities favour. I use it in this context, if you like, as it's generally accepted in the housing realm as being the most appropriate term. But I do know, for those of you listening, that this is not a term that is uncontroversial. You know, it's difficult, for example, to catch all people within a term. And of course, we're all individuals. So grouping people together is by its nature problematic. So I do note that. Okay, on to my next slide. I thought it'd be quite useful to demonstrate what the research network that I'm involved with has revealed so far in terms of the causes of BAME homelessness. And of course, many of the causes of homelessness apply to white households as well, but we've been researching specifically what are the principal causes of homelessness in the BAME population. And these, as you can see from the slide, these are the key causes of homelessness in these populations that we've identified. Social exclusion, poverty, and discrimination is absolutely front and centre. Many people from a BAME background will find themselves homeless because of the inherent discrimination which they experience, whether that be through employment practices, whether that may be through landlords when they seek a private rent, or whether that may be in their interactions with the local authority. There is a definite problem with discrimination, and this has a correlation to homelessness in the BAME population. The next major cause is that many in the BAME population are less well off, have fewer resources in order to overcome housing precarity. Now, that may sound like a generalization, but statistically speaking, BAME homeless people tend to have less financial resource available to them in order to assist them out of homelessness. So that's a key problem here. Other causes relate to domestic violence, family breakdown, and housing stress. There is a particular relationship between BAME households and often multi-generational households, so multiple generations living within the same home. This can lead to issues in relation to family breakdown and, as I say, housing stress, overcrowding, for example, which can lead to homelessness. The next cause of homelessness relates to certain ethnic groups, but not others. So this is where we have to be sensitive to this catch-all phrase BAME, because of course, to some extent, it is problematic. But in certain populations, there is forced marriage, and that can lead to increases in homelessness. Immigration status often impacts access to housing. In England, we have very strict rules in relation to accessing housing if you are an immigrant. And that acts as a barrier to people from BAME communities accessing the housing that they need. And finally, and this is something that I touched on at the beginning, but I flag it up here as another, if you like, a highlighted theme that comes out of the research, the racial discrimination in housing and employment. Part of the work that we've been doing with the network is speaking to homeless people themselves, people who've experienced homelessness from BAME populations. And I can tell you that they regularly report examples of quite extreme racial discrimination in terms of accessing housing and in their employment opportunities and practices. All of these things can contribute to the greater incidence of homelessness in the BAME population, as the research that I'm leading on demonstrates. And the next slide really feeds into that, which is, what is the experience of BAME people when they are in the system, if you like, for seeking homelessness support? In other words, what happens when people from a BAME background approach their local authority and ask for help because they are homeless? What experiences are they having? What's the interaction with local authorities? And this is quite interesting because the research is showing trends which are, well, negative trends, problematic experiences of BAME people in this homelessness context. And it's, if you like, it's these experiences which for me are the catalyst for thinking more deeply about BAME homelessness and what role the law can play. So the first thing to note is that there is a distinct lack of awareness amongst certain BAME populations of the homelessness support that is available. And this lack of awareness means that many people who could be assisted to avoid homelessness find themselves homeless because they don't realise the services are there to be accessed. There are also issues in relation to pathways through the services. So many of the homeless people that I've spoken to as part of the research have revealed stories of being pushed away, turned away from support based on racial grounds. So their pathway through the services is often blocked or inhibited as a result of racial discrimination and harassment. The next part, interaction with local authorities, homelessness departments. Well, there is a worrying trend amongst the research, demonstrated through the research, that many homeless people, BAME homeless people, experience very negatively their interactions with homelessness departments. They are routinely talked down to, patronised, misunderstood or misrepresented as a result of their particular BAME background. This is very problematic and comes out loud and clear from the research also. And finally, a more systematic problem here is the lack of local authority strategic vision on BAME homelessness. What we're finding is that many local authority areas do not have policies, research groups, members of their team who are thinking about these issues in relation to BAME experience of homelessness services. Most local authorities are, for want of a better expression, pale, male and stale, and they do not reflect the population that they are serving. And this, I think, is part of the problematic nature of the experiences of BAME people when it comes to homelessness. So that's, if you like, the impetus for me and the research that I'm doing. What role then for the law? And this is where my legal training comes in. We've identified the problem. We've identified the ongoing issues in relation to BAME experiences in this area. What can the law do? Well, there's been a lot of law. We had the Race Relations Act of 1976. We have an Equality Act from 2010, various homelessness legislation, all of which says on its face that it is unlawful to discriminate against people based on their race. So the law on its face is anti-discrimination. However, the law is not fulfilling its potential here because, if you like, it acts as a floor, not a ceiling. In other words, it states quite clearly there should be no direct, overt discrimination. What it doesn't do is tackle the real problem, which is the hidden, indirect discrimination, which my research network is exposing in terms of the BAME population. What we're seeing is that there is gatekeeping of resources, that there is racial harassment and discrimination by housing officers on the ground. And perhaps more technically than that, some of the inherent principles of law are by their nature operating in a manner which could be indirectly discriminatory. For example, the housing legislation will afford housing to certain groups of people where accommodation is available to them. That has to be interpreted. That is a concept which the courts have interpreted, and the evidence supports a finding that the interpretation itself is indirectly discriminatory against BAME populations. So there is discrimination that goes to the very heart of the legal principles that determine who gets homelessness support in England. Another quick example for you, the law has relatively recently imported a requirement for local connection. You have to show that you have a local connection to your particular geographical area in England before you get assistance. Now, you can imagine that if you are from a certain BAME population, maybe you are an immigrant, maybe family members have come to England to join you from abroad, this local connection requirement is going to be very difficult for you to demonstrate and may prevent you from gaining access to housing support. And in this way, this requirement for local connection can indirectly discriminate against certain communities in England. I could go on within various examples. The key point really here is that what our research network is demonstrating is that the discrimination in housing and homelessness runs very deep. You can spot it talking to homeless people who will tell you their experiences, but the law has a role because the legal principles themselves perpetrate largely indirect discrimination against certain ethnicities and certain populations. So what I am going to do as I move to the next stage of the research is look at how we can reform homelessness law in England to tackle this indirect and hidden discrimination, which continues to blight our populations in England. The data on BAME homelessness that I started this paper with goes back decades. The experience of non-white households has long been a problem in England. And I think the time has come for us to refocus and explore the potentiality of law to tackle this discrimination, and how new legislation, new legal principles could be framed, building on this research to tackle discrimination in this context. And I'm conscious I've gone slightly over time. So Astrid, I will stop there. As I say, a different flavour from the paper we heard before mine, but hopefully interesting for you all nonetheless.